A simple seat reassignment. That's how it began. Leo McAllister, 78, medals tucked away in his army jacket pocket, said nothing when Janice Whitmore bumped him from first class. "There must be a mistake," she announced loudly, eyes, sweeping over his weathered black skin. Decades of similar indignities had taught Leo which battles to fight. He simply nodded and moved to economy, while Captain Harris glanced curiously at the elderly veteran. No one could have predicted that 9 minutes later, this routine flight would transform into a reckoning. As the truth about Leo's heroism in Vietnam emerged, how he'd rescued 19 men, including the captain's brother, the aircraft became an unlikely courtroom where history's wrongs would finally face judgment. Some injustices wait years to be corrected. Some only need 9 minutes and the courage of those who refuse to look away. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport hummed with the chaos of Veterans Day weekend. Announcements echoed through the terminal, bouncing off glass and steel, barely audible over the symphony of rolling luggage, crying children, and hurried footsteps. Holiday travelers clutched coffee cups and boarding passes, their faces a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. Leo McAllister moved slowly through the crowd, his gait steady but unhurried. At 78, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed to part the rushing masses. His army jacket, pressed and spotless, hung from broad shoulders that time had only slightly stooped. Medals clinked softly against the green fabric, polished to a shine but not ostentatious. They weren't meant to impress. They were simply part of who he was. The flight to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to depart in 40 minutes. Leo had arrived early, as was his habit, a military precision that hadn't left him in the 50 years since Vietnam. He watched a group of young soldiers in uniform pass by, their faces smooth and untroubled. One caught his eye and nodded respectfully. Leo returned the gesture with a slight smile. At gate C-23, a woman's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife. "No, I don't care what the app says. The boarding process begins when I say it begins." Janice Whitmore stood behind the counter, her airline supervisor badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back so tightly, it seemed to stretch her skin, giving her face a permanently surprised expression. She tapped manicured nails against the counter as she berated a young gate agent. "You need to check every boarding pass twice. We had 3 people in the wrong seats last flight, because you weren't paying attention." The young man nodded, his eyes downcast. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." Janice's gaze swept over the waiting area, scrutinizing the passengers. Her eyes lingered a beat longer on a black family near the window, then darted to a Hispanic couple speaking Spanish. Her lips pursed slightly before she turned back to her computer. Leo settled into a seat near the boarding area, placing his small carry-on between his feet. He watched as a young woman struggled with an overstuffed diaper bag, a squirming toddler, and a folded stroller. The child began to wail as the mother fumbled with her belongings. Without hesitation, Leo rose and approached her. "Ma'am, would you like some help with that?" The woman looked up, relief flooding her face. "Would you? That would be amazing." Leo took the stroller and deftly unfolded it with practiced hands. "I had 3 of my own once upon a time," he said warmly. "Though that was many years ago." The woman smiled gratefully as she settled her child into the stroller. "Thank you so much, sir. Not many people would stop to help these days." "It's no trouble at all," Leo replied, helping her organize the scattered toys and pacifiers that had fallen from her bag. From behind the counter, Janice watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. Her mouth tightened into a thin line as she observed Leo helping the young mother. When the woman offered Leo a place in line ahead of her as thanks, Janice's posture stiffened. "First-class passengers may now begin boarding," Janice announced, her voice cutting through the terminal. Her eyes swept over the waiting area, cataloging faces with clinical efficiency. Leo reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his boarding pass. He'd splurged on this trip, a first-class ticket, something he rarely did. But today was special. His old friend Marcus was being honored at Arlington, and Leo wanted to arrive without the usual aches and pains that economy seating inflicted on his aging body. He approached the gate, boarding pass in hand. Janice's eyes flicked from the pass to his face, then back again. A frown creased her forehead. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This can't be right." Leo looked confused. "Is something wrong with my boarding pass?" Janice took the pass from his hand, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "This seat is reserved. There must be an error in the system." "I purchased it 3 months ago," Leo said quietly. "Seat 2A. Janice didn't bother checking her computer. "That's not possible. That seat is reserved for our platinum members." Her eyes swept over Leo's well-worn shoes and simple carry-on. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait while I sort this out." Several passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman in a crisp suit frowned at Janice before looking away quickly. "There are plenty of seats in coach," Janice continued, her voice carrying. "You'll be more comfortable there anyway." Leo's face remained calm, though something flickered in his eyes. A dull pain, quickly masked. It wasn't a new feeling. He'd felt it at lunch counters in the 1960s, at job interviews in the 1970s, at bank loans in the 1980s. He recognized it like an old, unwelcome acquaintance. "I understand," he said simply, taking the coach boarding pass she thrust at him. "I've dealt with worse." As Leo moved to the side, a tall man in a pilot's uniform paused in the jet bridge entrance. Captain William Harris observed the exchange, his brow furrowing slightly. Something about the elderly man caught his attention, a vague familiarity he couldn't place. He watched as Leo squared his shoulders and moved toward the economy line with quiet dignity. The captain opened his mouth, as if to speak, then closed it. He had a pre-flight checklist to complete, and the interaction, while unsettling, wasn't his immediate concern. Still, as he turned to walk down the jet bridge, he glanced back once more at Leo. On the plane, Kelsey Johnson moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, hanging jackets and offering pre-flight beverages. The young flight attendant's braided hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform crisp and professional despite the long day she'd already put in. As she checked the passenger manifest on her tablet, she frowned. "That's odd," she murmured, to herself. She clearly saw McAllister Leonard E. assigned to seat 2A, but the seat was now occupied by a hurried businessman who hadn't looked up from his phone since boarding. Kelsey glanced toward economy class, wondering about the discrepancy. She'd witnessed similar errors before when Janice was working the gate. The supervisor had a reputation among the crew, not a good one. Back in economy, Leo settled into the middle seat of row 23. The space was tight for his tall frame, his knees pressing against the seat in front of him. He didn't complain. Across the aisle, Ethan Cole watched Leo from the corner of his eye. At 35, Ethan carried himself with the hyper-awareness of someone who'd seen too much. His press credentials hung around his neck. He was heading to D.C. to cover a Pentagon briefing, another stop in a career spent documenting conflicts from Afghanistan to Ukraine. Something about the old man intrigued him. It wasn't just the medals or the military bearing. It was the calm in his eyes, the kind Ethan had only seen in those who'd stared into the abyss and made peace with it. "Heading to D.C.?" Ethan asked, breaking the ice. Leo nodded. "Paying respects to an old friend. Army." Ethan gestured to Leo's jacket. "Yes, sir, 173rd Airborne Brigade. Long time ago now." Ethan was about to reply when a woman in her 70s settled into the window seat beside Leo. She smiled warmly at him. "I'm Beatrice Ruiz," she said, extending a hand. "Looks like we'll be neighbors for the next couple of hours." "Leo McAllister," he replied with a gentle handshake. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am." "Are you visiting family in Washington?" she asked. Leo's eyes softened. "No, ma'am. My Martha passed 5 years ago. Our children are scattered now. California, Texas, Georgia. I'm visiting Arlington. An old friend is being honored tomorrow." Mrs. Ruiz nodded sympathetically. "My Alberto has been gone 3 years now. It gets easier, but never easy." As they continued talking, Other passengers in nearby seats found themselves drawn into the conversation. Leo spoke of Atlanta in the 1960s, of raising children during the civil rights movement, of watching the city transform over decades. He told stories about his late wife's garden, how she could make roses bloom in the poorest soil. What he didn't mention were the medals, the nightmares, or the sound of helicopter rotors that still woke him at 3 a.m. In the galley, Janice cornered Kelsey, speaking in hushed but forceful tones. "That man was trying to take someone else's seat," she insisted. "I've seen it before. They buy economy tickets and try to sneak into first class." Kelsey kept her face neutral. "The manifest shows him assigned to 2A. It was purchased months ago." "The system makes mistakes," Janice snapped. "I'm just following policy. People can't just sit wherever they want." Kelsey didn't argue. Her job depended on avoiding conflicts with supervisors like Janice, but as she moved through the cabin preparing for takeoff, she kept glancing back at economy, where Leo sat between. The armrests too large for the space, too dignified to complain. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. The soft ping of the seatbelt sign turning off barely audible over the engine's hum. Sunlight streamed through the windows on the left side of the plane, casting long rectangles of light across the aisle. In first class, the businessman who'd taken Seat 2A was already 2 drinks in, loudly explaining stock options to his seatmate, who nodded with the glazed expression of someone trapped in conversation. 3 rows behind them, a middle-aged couple whispered to each other, occasionally glancing toward economy class. "I saw his ticket when we were in line," the woman murmured. "It definitely said first class." Her husband frowned. "That gate agent was completely out of line. Did you see how she didn't even check the computer?" "It's disgusting," his wife replied, "especially on Veterans Day weekend." Similar conversations rippled through the cabin, hushed voices, concerned glances, people comparing notes about what they'd witnessed at the gate. Mrs. Ruiz leaned closer to Leo. "You know, I was right behind you in line. I saw your boarding pass. It said first class." Leo smiled gently. "It's all right, ma'am. I don't mind where I sit." "But I mind," she said firmly. "That woman had no right to treat you that way." Leo patted her hand. "I've learned to choose my battles carefully. Some aren't worth fighting." Across the aisle, Ethan watched the exchange with growing interest. As a journalist, he'd developed an instinct for stories, and his instincts were buzzing now. He studied Leo's military insignia more carefully, noting the distinctive patch of the 173rd Airborne and the subtle arrangement of medals, not the kind given for showing up, but the kind given for acts of valor. In the back galley, Kelsey scrolled through the seating manifest on her tablet during a quick break. She pulled up the original boarding list and compared it with the current seating arrangement. There it was in black and white. Leonard McAllister, seat 2A, ticket purchased 94 days ago. The seat had been reassigned only 37 minutes before boarding, manually overridden by Jay Whitmore. Kelsey bit her lip, unsure what to do with this information. As the only black flight attendant on duty, she felt the sting of the injustice personally, but she also knew the risks of making waves. 6 months away from her final interview for the international crew, she couldn't afford to be labeled a troublemaker. In the cockpit, Captain Harris reviewed the flight plan while his co-pilot handled communications with air traffic control. Something kept nagging at him. That elderly veteran in economy. The name Leonard McAllister tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. "Everything okay, Captain?" First Officer Jenkins asked, noticing Harris's distraction. "Yeah, just thinking about something my brother mentioned once," Harris replied. "He was a general before he retired. Used to tell stories about Vietnam, about the men who served under him." He shook his head. "It's probably nothing." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had changed subtly. What began as scattered whispers had grown into a current of discontent. Passengers who normally would have kept to themselves were leaning across aisles, sharing what they'd witnessed. A college student removed her headphones long enough to tell her seatmate, "My dad's a vet. If someone treated him like that, I'd lose my mind." 2 rows up, a businessman in his 50s was recounting. "I fly this route twice a month. That supervisor has a history. Last month she made a Hispanic family with a crying baby move to the back, claimed they were disturbing other passengers. Nobody was complaining except her. In seat 14D, a tech executive named Dev Taylor overheard these conversations. He'd witnessed the entire incident at the gate while waiting to board in business class. Dark-skinned and impeccably dressed, Dev had experienced his share of random security checks and unexplained seating changes. He'd developed a sixth sense for discriminatory treatment. During the drink service, Kelsey made her way down the aisle, making a point to stop at Leo's row. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" she asked warmly. "Just water would be fine, thank you," Leo replied. "Are you comfortable? I notice it's a bit tight for you in this seat." Leo smiled. "I've slept in foxholes, young lady. This is luxury by comparison." As Kelsey handed him the water, she lowered her voice. "I saw your original seating assignment, sir. What happened wasn't right." Leo's eyes met hers, a moment of understanding passing between them. Sometimes life isn't right. We do the best we can with what we're given. When Kelsey moved on, Ethan caught her attention with a raised finger. As she leaned down to take his drink order, he whispered, "Did you notice anything off about that man's seat assignment?" Kelsey hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Meet me in the back galley in 10 minutes, she murmured, before asking loudly, "Ice with that, sir?" 10 minutes later, Ethan made his way to the rear of the aircraft, ostensibly heading to the lavatory. Kelsey was arranging drink carts, her back to the cabin. "What did you find out?" Ethan asked quietly. "He was definitely booked in first class," Kelsey confirmed. "Seat 2A purchased months ago. The supervisor manually overrode it right before boarding." "That's what I thought," Ethan said. "I'm a journalist. I cover war zones, not domestic stories. But something about this doesn't sit right." "Are you going to write about it?" Kelsey asked, looking concerned. "Maybe, but first I need to understand who he is. Those medals aren't for show." As they spoke, Dev approached the galley, pretending to stretch his legs. "Excuse me," he said, quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing. I saw the whole thing at the gate." Kelsey tensed. "Sir, I wasn't—" Dev raised a hand. "I'm on your side. That supervisor made assumptions based on how he looked. I've been there." He extended a hand to Ethan. "Dev Taylor. I work in tech, but I have experience documenting discrimination cases." Ethan shook his hand. "Ethan Cole, war correspondent." "What are you thinking?" Dev asked. "I'm thinking there's more to this story than an airline seat," Ethan replied. "The way he carries himself, those specific medals. I've interviewed enough veterans to know when someone has seen serious combat." Dev nodded thoughtfully. "I've got a secure internet connection through my company VPN. If you have a name, I can do some digging without raising flags." "Leonard McAllister," Kelsey supplied. "That's all I know." As their impromptu meeting broke up, Janice appeared at the end of the galley, her eyes narrowing at the three of them. "Kelsey, we need to restock first class," she said sharply. "And passengers should remain seated unless using the lavatory." Her gaze cut to Ethan and Dev. "Just stretching my legs," Dev said smoothly. "Blood clots are a risk on longer flights." Janice's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How considerate of you to worry about your health. Perhaps you should return to your seat now." When they dispersed, Janice cornered Kelsey. "What were you discussing with those passengers?" "They just had questions about the connecting flights in D.C., Kelsey lied, her heart racing. "Listen carefully," Janice hissed, leaning closer. "You're on thin ice already after that incident in Phoenix. One step out of line, and you'll be flying. Coach for life or not flying at all. Do I make myself clear?" Kelsey nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "Crystal clear, Ms. Whitmore." Back at his seat, Ethan opened his laptop, connecting to the plane's Wi-Fi through his cellular data. As a journalist, he had access to research databases not available to the general public. He typed, "Leonard McAllister, Vietnam, 173rd Airborne," into the search bar. The results loaded slowly on the aircraft's limited bandwidth. Most were general articles about the brigade's activities, nothing specific to Leo. Then, on the fourth page, a small headline caught his eye. Vietnam hero disappears from public life after Medal of Honor controversy. The article was from 1971, the scan fuzzy and difficult to read on the small screen. But there was a photo, grainy and yellowed with age. A young black soldier, tall and straight-backed, standing at attention as a superior officer pinned a medal to his chest. The caption read, "Sergeant Leonard E. McAllister receives Silver Star for Valor Under Fire, 1969. McAllister was later recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the award was never presented. Ethan stared at the image, then at the man sitting across the aisle. The young soldier's determined expression had weathered into the dignified calm of the elderly man, but the eyes were unmistakable, eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Meanwhile, in row 23, Leo was telling Mrs. Ruiz about his late wife's cooking. "Martha could make a feast from nothing," he said, smiling at the memory. "During the lean years, she'd take a single chicken and make it last a week. The children never knew how tight things were." "You must miss her terribly," Mrs. Ruiz said. "Every day," Leo replied softly. "But she lived well, loved deeply. Can't ask for more than that." A young woman in the row ahead turned around, unable to resist joining the conversation. "How long were you married?" 51 years, Leo answered. "Met her at a church picnic in '67, right before my second tour. She waited for me. Best decision I ever made was coming home to her." "Did you serve together?" the woman asked, gesturing to his jacket. Leo chuckled. "No, ma'am. Martha was braver than me. She was a schoolteacher in South Atlanta during integration. Those classrooms were the real front lines of change in this country." As he spoke, a small audience formed around him. There was something magnetic about Leo's presence, a combination of gentleness and strength that drew people in. He told stories of Atlanta's transformation, of raising children during turbulent times, of the communities that had formed and dissolved over decades. What he didn't say, what remained carefully tucked away, were the stories of firefights in dense jungle, of carrying wounded men through mortar fire, of the friend he was traveling to honor who died holding Leo's hand, whispering his children's names with his final breaths. In first class, the passenger in seat 2A was becoming increasingly intoxicated, demanding attention from the flight attendants and loudly complaining about the Wi-Fi speed. Several passengers exchanged glances, the contrast between his behavior and Leo's dignity and economy not lost on them. Near the front of the plane, Janice patrolled the aisles with clipboard in hand, her movement stiff and her smile forced. She avoided looking toward row 23, as if Leo's mere presence was an affront to her authority. In the cockpit, Captain Harris pulled out his personal tablet during a quiet moment. He opened his digital logbook, scrolling through old entries until he found his brother's name. General Thomas Harris had commanded a division in Vietnam before moving up to the Pentagon. During their last fishing trip, he'd mentioned a name, a soldier who'd saved his life during an ambush outside Saigon. Harris found the entry. Tom mentioned Leonard E. McAllister again, said the man should have received the Medal of Honor. Politics got in the way. Harris sat back in his seat, a chill running down his spine. Could it be the same man? After all these years, he activated the intercom to the cabin. "Kelsey, could you come to the cockpit for a moment?" When she arrived, Harris asked quietly, "That elderly veteran in economy, what's his full name?" "Leonard McAllister," Kelsey replied. "Leonard E. McAllister, I believe." Harris nodded slowly, his expression changing. "Thank you. That's all I needed to know." As Kelsey returned to the cabin, the pieces were falling into place. A veteran disrespected, a hidden hero, a journalist uncovering the truth, and a pilot suddenly realizing that the man sitting in economy might have saved his family's legacy. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would unfold in the cramped confines of an airplane traveling at 500 miles per hour, 30,000 feet above the earth. As the flight continued over the Appalachian Mountains, the sunlight shifted, casting long shadows through the cabin. The initial excitement of takeoff had settled into the drowsy rhythm of mid-flight routine. Drink service was complete, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Ethan Cole couldn't stop thinking about the article, he'd found. The grainy photo of a young Leonard McAllister receiving the Silver Star haunted him. There was more to this story, much more, and his journalistic instincts were on high alert. When Mrs. Ruiz excused herself to use the lavatory, Ethan saw his opportunity. He moved across the aisle and slid into her vacant seat beside Leo. "Mind if I join you for a minute, sir?" he asked. Leo looked up from his book and smiled. "Not at all, young man." Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I couldn't help noticing your 173rd Airborne patch. My uncle served in Vietnam, 25th Infantry Division." Leo nodded, his expression warming. "Good men in the 25th. Saw them in action near Pleiku in '68. "You must have some stories," Ethan said, his voice casual but his eyes watchful. Something shifted in Leo's face, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Everyone who served has stories, son. Most aren't worth retelling." "I've interviewed a lot of veterans," Ethan continued. "Part of my job as a correspondent. But it's rare to meet someone who—" He trailed off, gesturing subtly toward the ribbons on Leo's jacket. Leo looked down at his hands. Large, weathered hands that had once carried wounded men through gunfire, had once written letters home for dying soldiers, had once trembled while holding his newborn children. "I was a medic," Leo said finally. "Did what needed doing. Nothing special about that." "With the 173rd? Ethan pressed gently. "During which tour?" "2 tours, Leo replied. First in '67, then again in '69. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Your uncle make it home all right?" Ethan recognized the deflection but allowed it. "Yes, sir. Came home with all his limbs but left some of his peace of mind over there, I think. Like a lot of men." Leo nodded. "That's how it goes. You never really leave a war behind. You just learn to carry it quieter." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Ethan knew better than to push too hard. "Your family meeting you in D.C.?" he asked instead. Leo shook his head. "No. This trip is personal. Paying respects to someone who didn't make it home the same way I did." Before Ethan could respond, Mrs. Ruiz returned, and he yielded her seat with a respectful nod to Leo. "Thank you for your service, sir. Truly." Leo's eyes met his, something unreadable passing through them. "And thank you for your interest, young man. Not everyone remembers anymore." As Ethan returned to his seat, his mind raced. Leo's reluctance to discuss his service, the specific mention of 1969, the same year as the Silver Star in the article, all pointed to a man carrying a significant history. But why had he disappeared from public recognition? What had happened to the Medal of Honor recommendation mentioned in the article? Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Harris was lost in thought. The flight was on autopilot, cruising smoothly through clear skies, giving him time to sift through old memories. His brother Tom, 15 years his senior, had commanded troops in Vietnam when Harris was still in high school. The stories Tom told after returning home had inspired Harris to become a pilot. Harris opened his logbook again, scanning the entries from years of conversations with his brother. There it was, a note from 5 years ago. Tom mentioned McAllister again, said he still has nightmares about the bunker collapse, said 19 men owe their lives to a medic who wouldn't stop going back in. Harris stared at the name. Leonard E. McAllister. The pieces began falling into place in his mind. His brother had spoken of a brave medic who'd pulled men from a collapsed bunker under heavy fire, who'd refused to leave anyone behind despite being wounded himself. But whenever Harris asked why the man hadn't received more recognition, Tom would fall silent. A memory surfaced. His brother, drunk after their father's funeral, muttering about the damn politics of it all and how they couldn't stand the idea of giving it to a black man back then. Harris felt his hands tremble slightly. If this was the same McAllister, if this humble elderly man in economy class was the soldier who'd saved his brother's life, he made a decision. Reaching for his intercom, he called his co-pilot. "Jenkins, take the controls for a bit. I need to check something." In the main cabin, Leo had closed his eyes, not sleeping, but retreating into memory. The conversation with Ethan had stirred, things he usually kept carefully contained. In his mind, he was 23 again, the humid air of Vietnam clinging to his skin like a second uniform. The memory came in vivid flashes, not the sanitized version he sometimes shared at veterans' gatherings, but the raw, unfiltered truth. July 16, 1969. The bunker near Dak To had taken a direct hit from enemy mortars. Leo heard the screams before. He saw the damage, anguished cries of men trapped in the collapsed structure. Without waiting for orders, he grabbed his medic bag and ran toward the chaos. "McAllister, get back here," his lieutenant shouted. "That's a death trap." Leo ignored him. The first man he pulled out was barely conscious, blood seeping through his uniform. "Easy, soldier," Leo murmured, dragging him behind what remained of a concrete wall. He went back in 6 times, each journey more dangerous than the last, as the structure continued to collapse. On the 7th trip, he found a young officer pinned under a fallen beam, the nameplate on his uniform reading Harris. "Don't leave me," the officer pleaded, his eyes wide with fear. "Not a chance, sir," Leo promised, somehow finding the strength to lift the beam enough for Harris to pull himself free. As they emerged from the ruins, enemy fire intensified. Leo felt the bullet rip through his shoulder but kept moving, half carrying Harris to safety. Only when the wounded officer was in the hands of another medic did Leo allow himself to acknowledge his own injury. Later, as he lay in the field hospital, his commander visited. "Putting you up for the Medal of Honor," the man said gruffly. "Never seen anything like what you did today." But the medal never came. Months later, Leo learned that the recommendation had been downgraded to a Silver Star. No explanation was offered, but he didn't need one. He'd seen the same story play out too many times before. Leo opened his eyes, returning to the present. Mrs. Ruiz was looking at him with concern. "Are you all right? You seemed far away just now." Leo smiled gently. "Just old memories, ma'am. Nothing to worry about." Across the aisle, Ethan had opened his laptop again, digging deeper into the sparse information available about Leonard McAllister. Most of the military records from that era weren't digitized, but he found a mention in a Vietnam Veterans Association newsletter from 1995. "Whatever happened to Leonard McAllister? Contact the editor if you have information." It seemed Leo had deliberately faded from public view, avoiding reunions and recognition events. But why? What would make a decorated veteran disappear so completely? Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Kelsey and Dev had met again, comparing notes on what they'd discovered. "I checked the seating logs more carefully," Kelsey whispered. "Janice didn't just reassign him, she specifically flagged his reservation for security verification before manually moving him to economy." Dev's expression hardened. "That's a serious violation of airline policy. Those flags are only supposed to be used for actual security concerns, not personal prejudice." "I've seen her do similar things before," Kelsey admitted. "But never this, blatant. Usually she's more careful about covering her tracks." "We need to document everything," Dev said. "Screenshots, timestamps, the original manifest. I'll help you file the report properly so it can't be brushed aside." As they spoke, they didn't notice Janice approaching from behind until her shadow fell across them. "What an interesting conversation," she said coldly. "Perhaps you'd like to share it with HR when we land." Kelsey felt her heart sink but kept her expression neutral. "Ms. Whitmore, we were just discussing the catering discrepancy for the return flight." Janice's eyes narrowed. "Don't insult my intelligence, Kelsey. I know exactly what you're doing." She turned to Dev. "And you, sir, should return to your seat. This area is for crew only." Dev met her gaze steadily. "Of course. Just stretching. My legs." As he turned to leave, he managed to slip his business card into Kelsey's pocket, a silent promise of support. Janice waited until Dev was out of earshot before leaning closer to Kelsey. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I suggest you remember your place. One word from me, and your dream of international routes disappears forever. Instead of intimidation, Kelsey felt a surprising surge of resolve. Is that what you said to Mr. McAllister before you took his rightful seat? To remember his place? Janice's face flushed with anger. That's completely different. I was following protocol. No, you weren't, Kelsey interrupted, her voice low but firm. The manifest shows he had a confirmed first-class reservation. You deliberately moved him because of how he looked. That's not protocol, Ms. Whitmore. That's discrimination. Before Janice could respond, Captain Harris appeared at the galley entrance, his face somber. Is there a problem here? He asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of command. Janice immediately straightened, her demeanor shifting. Not at all, Captain. Just clarifying some service expectations with Kelsey. Harris's gaze moved between them, clearly sensing the tension. Kelsey, would you give us a moment, please? When Kelsey had moved away, Harris turned to Janice. Ms. Whitmore, I need to understand something. There's a passenger in economy, an elderly veteran named Leonard McAllister. According to the manifest, he was originally booked in first class. Can you explain why he was moved? Janice's confident facade faltered slightly. There was a seating issue that required reallocation. It's a routine matter. Nothing to concern yourself with, Captain. I see, Harris said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. And this routine matter just happened to affect a decorated veteran on Veterans Day weekend? I had no way of knowing his military status, Janice said defensively. And frankly, Captain, seat assignments are gate operations, not flight crew jurisdiction. Harris studied her for a long moment. You're right about one thing, Ms. Whitmore. It's not my jurisdiction, but passenger safety and dignity are. I'm going to ask you to take a seat in the jump seat for the remainder of the flight. The other attendants can handle service. Janice's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. On what grounds? I believe your presence is creating tension that could affect cabin harmony, Harris replied evenly. It's within my authority as captain to make that determination. We'll sort out the details once we're on the ground. Without waiting for her response, Harris turned and walked back toward the cockpit, leaving Janice standing in stunned silence. In economy class, something subtle had shifted. Passengers who had witnessed Leo's quiet dignity throughout the flight began treating him with increasing deference. A young man offered him a pillow. The flight attendant serving his section made sure his water glass was never empty. Mrs. Ruiz shared her cookies with him, insisting he needed them more than she did. Leo noticed the change but didn't understand its cause. He'd spent a lifetime being invisible, first by circumstance, later by choice. This sudden attention made him uneasy. Ethan, watching this transformation, realized that word was spreading throughout the cabin. Someone must have recognized Leo's name or his medals. The hidden hero was being unveiled, one whispered conversation at a time. Taking advantage of the in-flight Wi-Fi, Ethan composed an email to his editor friend at the Washington Post, Marcus, working on what might be a significant story. Leonard E. McAllister, Vietnam vet, 173rd Airborne, Silver Star recipient, possibly denied Medal of Honor due to racial politics. Currently on a flight where he was bumped from first class under suspicious circumstances. More details when we land, but you might want to have someone at Reagan National around 5 p.m. Ethan. He attached the grainy photo he'd found and hit send, watching the progress bar slowly advance on the limited airplane connection. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ruiz had become Leo's unofficial advocate. She'd moved through several rows, quietly telling other passengers about the injustice she'd witnessed. That poor man had a first-class ticket, she told a group of attentive listeners. I saw it with my own eyes. That supervisor took one look at him and decided he didn't belong there. The story spread through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers, leaning across aisles and turning in their seats to catch a glimpse of the elderly veteran who'd been wronged. Some shared their own stories of discrimination or of veterans in their lives who'd been mistreated. My father served in Desert Storm, a young woman said. Came home with PTSD, and the VA turned him away 3 times before he got help. My uncle was in Vietnam, another passenger added. Black man like Mr. McAllister. Came home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge his service. A collective indignation built, bridging differences of age and background. The shared sense of injustice created an unusual solidarity among strangers who, under normal circumstances, would have remained absorbed in their own private journeys. In the cockpit, Captain Harris stood in the doorway, staring down the aisle toward economy class. From this angle, he could just make out Leo's profile, the strong jawline, the dignified posture. The resemblance to the young soldier in his memory was unmistakable. "That's him," Harris whispered to himself. "That's the man who saved my brother." The flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. was beginning its initial descent. The cabin lights brightened slightly as flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash and preparing for landing. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, the Potomac River visible in the distance. In the cockpit, Captain William Harris made a decision that would change everything. He'd spent the last 30 minutes in quiet contemplation, weighing professional protocol against a deeper sense of justice. In the end, there was no real choice to make. "Jenkins," he said to his co-pilot, "take over. I need to do something." First Officer Jenkins looked surprised, but nodded. "You got it, Captain. Everything okay?" Harris removed his captain's hat and set it on his seat. "Something I should have done a long time ago." With purpose in his stride, Harris made his way through first class. Passengers looked up in surprise. It was unusual to see the captain moving through the cabin during descent. He paused briefly at the front galley, where Kelsey was securing the beverage cart. "I'm going to need the intercom," he said quietly. Kelsey handed him the phone, curiosity evident in her expression. Harris took a deep breath, pressed the button, and addressed the entire aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harris speaking. We've begun our descent into Reagan National Airport and will be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. But before we land, there's something important I need to share with all of you." Throughout the cabin, passengers looked up from books and screens, tuning into the unusual mid-descent announcement. "There is a man on this flight who deserves more than our thanks," Harris continued, his voice steady and clear over the intercom. "He deserves our nation's honor. 56 years ago, during one of the darkest days of the Vietnam War, this man risked his life repeatedly to save 19 soldiers trapped in a collapsed bunker under enemy fire. One of those soldiers was my brother." A hush fell over the cabin as passengers began looking around, wondering who the captain was talking about. Harris continued, "For reasons that had nothing to do with his courage and everything to do with the color of his skin, this man never received the full recognition he deserved. Today, he was denied his rightful seat on this aircraft. I believe it's time we all stood up and corrected at least one of these injustices." With the intercom still in hand, Harris began walking deliberately through the cabin toward economy class. Passengers watched in stunned silence as he moved down the aisle, his gaze fixed ahead. In row 23, Leo McAllister sat perfectly still, his eyes wide with disbelief as he realized the captain was talking about him. Mrs. Ruiz reached over and squeezed his hand. When Harris reached Leo's row, he stopped and faced the elderly veteran. For 9 heartbeats, the two men simply looked at each other, the airline captain in his crisp uniform and the aging soldier in his well-worn army jacket. Then, with deliberate ceremony, Harris handed the intercom to Kelsey, who had followed behind him, and executed a perfect military salute. "Sergeant Leonard McAllister," Harris said, his voice clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "On behalf of my brother, General Thomas Harris, and the other 18 men you saved that day, thank you, sir." Leo sat frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition. Slowly, almost as if in a dream, he rose to his feet, his tall frame straightening despite the years of wear. With dignity that transcended his surroundings, he returned the salute. "I'm just a soldier who did his duty, Captain," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing more." "You're much more than that, sir," Harris replied. "You're the reason I have a family. My brother came home, had children, grandchildren, all because of your courage." Throughout the cabin, passengers began to understand what was happening. One by one, they stood, first the veterans among them, then others who recognized the significance of the moment. A spontaneous wave of applause began, rippling through the aircraft. Leo's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I never served to be thanked," he said quietly. "I know," Harris replied. "That's why it matters so much that you are." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of history and sacrifice hanging in the air between them. Then Harris gestured toward the front of the plane. "Your seat in first class is waiting, Sergeant McAllister. Where you belonged, all along." Leo shook his head, a gentle smile crossing his face. "I appreciate the gesture, Captain, but we're landing soon. No need to cause a commotion now." Harris was about to insist when Janice pushed her way through the standing passengers, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is completely unprofessional," she hissed at Harris. "You're disrupting the entire flight for a seating issue that was resolved at the gate." Her words fell into a sudden silence as passengers turned to stare at her. The contrast between the captain's reverence and her dismissive attitude was stark and jarring. Before Harris could respond, Ethan stepped into the aisle, holding up his phone. "Actually, it wasn't resolved. It was manipulated, and I have proof." He pressed play on a recording Kelsey had made earlier, showing the original manifest with Leo's name clearly assigned to seat 2A, followed by Janice's manual override just before boarding. "You deliberately moved him," Ethan said, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "The question is why?" Janice's face went pale. "That's airline proprietary information. You can't—" "Actually, I can," Dev interjected, standing up from his seat in business class. "As a frequent flyer who witnessed discrimination, I have every right to document it. And as someone who's successfully litigated 3 similar cases, I can tell you this won't end well for the airline, or for you personally." Janice looked around desperately, searching for support but finding none. The unified disapproval of the entire cabin was palpable. For perhaps the first time in her career, she had no procedural shield to hide behind. "I was just following policy," she stammered, but the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. "No," Kelsey said firmly. "You were following your prejudice." Throughout this exchange, Leo remained standing, his expression one of profound discomfort. He had never sought confrontation or recognition. His entire life after Vietnam had been built around quiet service and dignity in the face of injustice. "Please," he said finally, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't necessary. What's done is done." But Harris shook his head. "With respect, sir, that's the problem. Too many things have been done to you without consequence. Not today. Not on my aircraft." Harris turned to Kelsey. "Please escort Ms. Whitmore to the jump seat for landing. When we reach the gate, airport security will meet us to take statements." As Kelsey led a shell-shocked Janice away, passengers began recording the scene on their phones. Within minutes, social media would be flooded with images of the airline captain saluting the elderly veteran, the beginning of a story that would soon spread far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Harris turned back to Leo. "Sir, I insist, for the remaining minutes of this flight, please take your rightful seat." Leo looked around at the expectant faces surrounding him, Mrs. Ruiz nodding encouragement, Ethan watching with respectful interest, dozens of strangers whose expressions ranged from curiosity to admiration. After a lifetime of stepping aside, of choosing battles carefully, of accepting less than he deserved, something shifted inside him. "All right, Captain," he said quietly. "Lead the way." As Leo moved through the cabin toward first class, passengers reached out to touch his sleeve, to shake his hand, to whisper quick thanks. A young soldier in uniform stood at attention as Leo passed. A woman pressed a small American flag pin into his palm with tears in her eyes. In first class, the businessman who had been enjoying Leo's seat looked up in confusion as Harris approached with Leo. "Sir," Harris said firmly, "I need you to take another seat for landing." The man opened his mouth to protest, then saw the expressions on the faces around him and thought better of it. "Of course," he muttered, gathering his belongings. Leo settled into seat 2A, the leather cool and soft beneath him. He ran his weathered hands over the armrests, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My Martha would have loved this," he said softly. "She always did appreciate the finer things." As the plane continued its descent, flight attendants, moved through the cabin, securing loose items and checking that seatbelts were fastened. But there was a different energy now, a sense of having witnessed something important, something true. In the cockpit, First Officer Jenkins raised an eyebrow as Harris returned to his seat. "Everything okay back there?" Sounded like quite the commotion. Harris put his captain's hat back on and took the controls. "Everything's exactly as it should be," he replied. "For once." The aircraft banked gently, lining up with the runway at Reagan National. Outside, the sun was setting over the Capitol, painting the monuments and memorials in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in that city was Arlington National Cemetery, where Leo's friend Marcus would be honored tomorrow, a ceremony Leo had nearly missed due to one woman's prejudice. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud, Leo looked out the window at the approaching city, unaware that his quiet life of anonymity was about to end. Unaware that Ethan's email had already triggered a flurry of activity in a newsroom across town. Unaware that Dev was already drafting a formal complaint that would reach the airline CEO's desk by morning. All Leo knew was that for the first time in decades, someone had seen him, truly seen him, not as an old black man to be dismissed, but as the hero he had never considered himself to be. As the wheels touched down on the runway, a spontaneous round of applause broke out. Not for the landing, but for the man in seat 2A and the captain who had stood up for him. In the terminal, alerted by passengers' social media posts and Ethan's email, a small group was already gathering at the gate: airport staff, military veterans, and a reporter with a photographer. Word had spread like wildfire. A Vietnam hero was arriving, a man whose story had been buried for too long. And Janice? As for, the aircraft taxied to the gate. She sat alone in the jump seat, her career effectively over. The airline's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination would see to that. But more devastating was the knowledge that would haunt her in the quiet hours to come, that she had tried to diminish a man whose shoes she wasn't worthy to shine. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. As passengers prepared to deplane, Leo remained, seated, momentarily overwhelmed by all that had transpired in the last 9 minutes. Harris stood in the cockpit doorway, watching as first-class passengers moved respectfully past Leo, many stopping to offer a word of thanks or a handshake. "Ready, sir?" Harris asked, approaching Leo's seat. Leo took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be, Captain." Together they walked toward the jet bridge, toward a reception neither of them had anticipated when the day began, toward a new chapter in a story 56 years in the making. Behind them, Ethan, Dev, and Kelsey exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. Sometimes justice arrived late, but arrive it did. The jet bridge at Reagan National Airport buzzed with unusual activity. Airport staff whispered among themselves, glancing repeatedly toward the aircraft door. A small group of veterans in VFW caps had assembled, alerted by a flurry of texts and calls. 2 local news reporters stood ready, cameras poised. As passengers began filing out of the plane, many paused to look back, creating a bottleneck in the narrow corridor. They were waiting for someone. Leo McAllister stepped through the aircraft door, blinking in the bright terminal lights. Captain Harris walked beside him, still hatless, his posture reflecting the respect he'd shown aboard the flight. Behind them came Ethan, quietly filming on his phone, and Dev, whose expression mixed satisfaction with lingering indignation. "What is all this?" Leo whispered, his eyes widening at the unexpected reception. Before Harris could respond, a middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd. She wore a blue blazer with a Veterans Affairs pin and carried a small lei made of red, white, and blue ribbons. With practiced dignity, she placed it over Leo's neck. "Sergeant McAllister," she said, her voice carrying in the suddenly hushed terminal. "Welcome home." Leo stood frozen, overwhelmed. The simple phrase, "welcome home," struck him with unexpected force. It was what he'd longed to hear 56 years ago, when he'd returned from Vietnam to a country that seemed determined to forget both the war and the men who'd fought it. The small crowd broke into applause. The veterans saluted. Several children waved miniature American flags. part of a school group that happened to be passing through. I don't understand, Leo said, his voice barely audible over the growing commotion. Captain Harris leaned closer. Word travels fast these days, especially when it's a story that's waited too long to be told. A reporter approached, microphone extended. Sergeant McAllister, can you tell us about what happened on today's flight? We're hearing reports that you were denied your first-class seat despite being a decorated Vietnam veteran. Leo hesitated, uncomfortable with the spotlight. There was a misunderstanding, he began diplomatically. The captain was kind enough to sort it out. It was more than a misunderstanding, Harris interjected firmly. It was an injustice, one of many that Sergeant McAllister has faced with dignity throughout his life. The reporter turned his attention to Harris. Captain, can you explain why you decided to intervene? Harris straightened, choosing his words carefully. This is Sergeant Leonard McAllister. In 1970, he saved my brother's life in Vietnam, along with 18 other men. He received the Silver Star for his actions, but was recommended for the Medal of Honor, a recognition that never came. Harris paused, emotion evident in his voice. Today, he reminded all of us what service looks like. True service isn't about recognition or reward. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. As Harris spoke, Ethan uploaded the video he'd been recording to his social media accounts. He added a brief caption, Vietnam. Hero Leonard McAllister, who saved 19 men under fire in 1970, denied first-class seat today. Watch what happened next. Leonard McAllister. Your veterans deserve respect. Within minutes, the clip began spreading. People tagged friends, shared it to veterans groups, added outraged comments. The algorithm recognized the rapidly growing engagement and pushed the content wider. Leo, unaware of his burgeoning online fame, found himself surrounded by well-wishers in the terminal. Veterans shook his hand. A young black soldier asked for a photo with him. Children offered him hand-drawn thank you cards intended for their Veterans Day School project. The attention clearly made Leo uncomfortable. He answered questions politely but briefly, his eyes occasionally darting toward the exit, seeking escape. When reporters began asking specifically about Janice's treatment of him, he raised a hand to quiet them. I don't judge people, he said, simply. I serve them. That's what I did in Vietnam, and that's what I've tried to do every day since. With that, he politely excused himself, mentioning that a friend was waiting to pick him up. As Leo made his way through the terminal, Ethan caught up with him. Sergeant McAllister, I'd like to talk with you more. Your story deserves to be told, properly. Leo studied the younger man thoughtfully. You seem like a decent fellow, but I didn't live my life for headlines. Not headlines, Ethan insisted. Truth. The same truth Captain Harris recognized today, that sometimes we need to correct the record, even decades later. Leo hesitated, then nodded slightly. I'm here for my friend Marcus's memorial tomorrow. After that, we can talk. He handed Ethan a slip of paper with his phone number before continuing toward the exit. Meanwhile, in a security office deeper in the terminal, Janice Whitmore sat rigidly in an uncomfortable chair. Across from her, 3 people faced her with equally stern expressions: an airline HR representative, legal counsel, and the airport's head of security. Ms. Whitmore, the HR representative began. We've reviewed the initial reports from the flight crew and passenger statements. The allegations are extremely serious. This is completely blown out of proportion, Janice protested. I was following standard procedures for managing our premium cabin. The lawyer leaned forward. Our records show that Mr. McAllister's first-class reservation was confirmed months ago. You manually overrode the system 37 minutes before boarding. What standard procedure does that follow? Janice's cold demeanor began to crack. There were platinum members who needed accommodation. I made a judgment call. Based on what criteria? The HR representative pressed. Experience. 22 years of experience telling me who belongs in first class and who doesn't. The words hung in the air, damning in their implication. Janice realized her mistake immediately, but it was too late to retract them. The security chief spoke for the first time. Ms. Whitmore, Are you aware that discriminatory actions in air travel can violate federal law? Janice's face went pale. I didn't. That's not what I... We've already received formal complaints from 3 passengers. The HR representative cut in. One is a corporate attorney specializing in discrimination cases. Another is a journalist who's already shared video. Evidence online. The lawyer slid a tablet across the table showing Ethan's video, now at 500,000 views and climbing rapidly. The comment section was a firestorm of outrage, with thousands demanding Janice be fired. The airline is issuing an immediate statement, the HR representative continued. You are suspended pending full investigation, effective immediately. Outside, in the passenger pickup area, Leo stood quietly by the curb. An old Ford pulled up, and a gray-haired black man rolled down the window. Leo, there you are. Was beginning to think you missed your flight. Leo smiled for what felt like the first time in hours. James, good to see you, brother. As he climbed into the passenger seat, James looked at him curiously. What's with the ribbon lay? And why are all those people looking over here? Leo sighed. It's a long story. Let's just say some old ghost decided to follow me to Washington. As they pulled away from the curb, neither man noticed the news van that had arrived or the reporter who recognized Leo from the viral video beginning to spread across the internet. Back inside the terminal, Kelsey found herself surrounded by her fellow flight attendants, all asking about what had happened. As she recounted the events, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from airline management, notifying her that she was suspended for violating company confidentiality by sharing passenger information. They suspended me, she said in disbelief, for doing the right thing. Dev, who had been speaking, with airport authorities nearby, overheard her. Don't worry, he said confidently. This won't stand. The court of public opinion has already made its ruling. He was right, by evening. But justice for Leo was trending on multiple platforms. The airline's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. Competitors seized the opportunity, posting about their own commitments to veteran support and anti-discrimination policies. Under mounting pressure, the airline issued a bland statement just after 8 p.m. We are investigating reports of a protocol breach on Flight 1382 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. We take all passenger concerns seriously and are committed to providing excellent service to all customers. The statement only fueled the outrage. Commentators tore it apart for its corporate speak and failure to acknowledge the specific discrimination against a decorated veteran. Boycott threats multiplied. By 10 p.m., the airline CEO had been pulled from a dinner to address the crisis. A new statement appeared. The events on today's Flight 1382 are deeply troubling and do not reflect our values. The employee in question has been suspended pending investigation. We have reached out to Sergeant McAllister to offer our profound apologies and appropriate compensation. Additionally, we are reinstating the flight attendant who bravely spoke up about this injustice. Meanwhile, in a modest hotel room near Arlington, Leo sat on the edge of the bed, watching in disbelief as his own face appeared on the evening news. The chyron beneath read, Vietnam hero faced discrimination on Veterans Day flight. He switched off the television and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of privacy. His phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, veterans, organizations, even a White House aide expressing the president's interest in his story. After decades of anonymity, of quiet service without recognition, Leo found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought. Part of him wanted to get on the next flight back to Atlanta, to retreat to the safety of his modest home with its faded photographs and treasured memories of Martha. But another part, a part he'd tried to silence for too long, felt a weight, lifting. The recognition wasn't just for him, it was for all the men who'd served alongside him, for all the veterans who'd come home to a country that preferred to look away. Leo picked up his phone and called Ethan. You still want that interview? He asked quietly. I think it's time. Morning light filtered through the curtains of Leo's modest Atlanta home. It had been 2 weeks since the flight that changed everything, 2 weeks of near-constant attention. He'd returned to find reporters camped outside his house, neighbors bringing casseroles as if he'd suffered a loss, and a stack of mail that, Included everything from thank you cards to speaking invitations. Today was different. Today, he'd agreed to tell his full story. Ethan Cole set up a camera in Leo's living room, adjusting the lighting to capture the wall of photographs behind the old soldier. Pictures of Leo's late wife Martha dominated the display. Martha in her wedding dress, Martha with their children, Martha in her garden. Interspersed were faded photographs of young men in uniform, some smiling, some serious, all looking impossibly young. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked, sensing Leo's nervousness. Leo nodded, settling into his worn armchair. "Not for me," he said quietly. "For them." He gestured toward the photographs, and for the ones who never made it home to take pictures like these. For the next 2 hours, Leo McAllister opened the book of his life, chapter by painful chapter. The camera captured every word, every expression, every long pause when emotion overcame his usual composure. "I was drafted in 1967, he began. 21 years old, engaged to the prettiest girl in Atlanta. Martha told me to go serve with honor and come back to her. So that's what I did." His voice strengthened as he spoke of his training as a medic. His first tour in Vietnam, the friends he'd made and lost. He described the chaos of combat with the clarity of someone who'd never truly left it behind. The sticky heat, the constant fear, the weight of responsibility for other men's lives. "July 16, 1969, Leo said, his eyes focused on something distant. "That's the day everything changed." In vivid detail, he recounted the bunker collapse near Dak To, how he'd run toward danger rather than away from it, how he'd pulled man after man from the rubble despite his own injuries, how he'd refused to leave until everyone was accounted for. "They put me up for the Medal of Honor," Leo said matter-of-factly. "My commanding officer, Major Phillips, said it was a sure thing. I didn't care about medals, but Martha would have been proud." "But you received the Silver Star instead," Ethan prompted gently. Leo nodded. 6 months later, I was called to division headquarters. Instead of the Medal of Honor, they gave me the Silver Star. No explanation offered. "Did you ever find out why?" A shadow passed over Leo's face. "Not officially. But word gets around. A general, not General Harris, someone higher up, had said, the optics aren't right for a colored boy to get the nation's highest honor." This was 1970, not ancient history. Ethan leaned forward. "How did that make you feel?" "At the time, I was angry. Not for myself, but because it meant nothing had really changed. My father had fought in World War II, came home to a country that wouldn't let him try on shoes in a department store. I thought my generation would be different." Leo paused, his large hands resting on his knees. "But anger doesn't get you very far. It certainly doesn't change minds." The interview delved deeper into Leo's life after Vietnam, his return to an America still deeply divided by race, his struggle to find employment despite his military service, the small indignities that accumulated like pebbles in a rucksack, weighing him down. "The breaking point came in 1972, Leo said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Martha was pregnant with our second child. She developed complications, nothing life-threatening if treated promptly. We drove to the nearest hospital. They told us to go to the colored facility across town." His eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "She miscarried in the parking lot. Our son never drew a breath." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the weight of Leo's words filling the room. "After that, something in me changed," Leo continued. "I didn't want recognition. I didn't want to be anybody's hero or symbol. I just wanted to live quietly, raise our daughter, and honor Martha's memory." He described his deliberate withdrawal from public life, turning down invitations to military reunions, declining to participate in veterans events, avoiding anything that might bring attention to his service. It wasn't shame that drove him. It was a bone-deep weariness with fighting battles that never seemed to end. "All those medals and citations," Leo said, gesturing to a small box on a shelf, "they don't keep you warm at night. They don't erase the nightmares. They don't bring back the friends you lost. So I focused on what does matter: family, community, quiet service." As the interview continued, Leo revealed a life of profound impact, lived almost entirely below the radar. He'd worked as a hospital orderly, a school custodian, and finally a groundskeeper at a local park, jobs that kept him connected to his community without drawing attention. On weekends, he volunteered at homeless shelters and veteran support groups, offering a listening ear to men whose stories echoed his own. "I never stopped serving," Leo said simply. "I just stopped expecting applause for it." When Ethan asked about the flight to Washington and Janice's treatment of him, Leo's response was characteristically gracious. "That woman carries her own burdens. I don't know what they are, but I recognize the weight of them. Hatred is heavy. I've watched it break stronger people than her." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the living room, Ethan asked his final question. "After everything you've experienced, the war, the discrimination, the personal losses, do you have any regrets?" Leo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to Martha's photograph. "Just one," he said finally. "I regret that Martha didn't live to see how far we've come. Not as far as we should, but further than many thought possible. She believed in this country even when it gave her little reason to. She'd be proud of the changes she helped make possible, one classroom at a time." After the interview concluded and the camera was packed away, Leo and Ethan sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "This story's going to make waves," Ethan said. "People need to hear it." Leo nodded slowly. "Just make sure they hear all of it, not just the parts that make them comfortable." Elsewhere in Atlanta, Kelsey Johnson opened her email to find a surprising message. The airline was offering her not just reinstatement, but a promotion to lead a new diversity and inclusion initiative within the cabin crew program. The message mentioned recognition of her courage in standing up for core values, and included a substantial signing bonus. She called Dev Taylor immediately. "They're offering me a promotion," she said in disbelief, "and they want me to help rewrite their training protocols." "Take it," Dev advised. "Change happens from the inside. Plus, the airline is desperate to salvage their reputation right now." Indeed, the airline's damage control was in full swing. After Ethan's initial video reached 5 million views and the story was picked up by major news outlets, they had shifted from corporate defensiveness to full apology mode. Their new statement acknowledged the inexcusable treatment of a decorated veteran and announced a company-wide review of practices. For Janice Whitmore, the fallout was swift and irreversible. She was terminated within 3 days of the incident, her 22 years with the airline erased by 9 minutes of revealed prejudice. Her name became a cautionary tale in corporate training seminars, a shorthand for the costs of unchecked bias. In a desperate attempt to salvage her reputation, Janice wrote a lengthy letter to Leo. Pages of explanation and justification led eventually to a single line of genuine contrition. "You showed grace. I didn't deserve it." When Ethan asked if Leo planned to respond, the old soldier shook his head. "Some people carry shame like others carry wounds," he said quietly. "I'd rather not cut deeper." As word of Leo's story spread, invitations began pouring in, veterans organizations wanting to honor him, schools requesting speaking engagements, politicians eager to be photographed with the humble hero. Most significantly, a call came from the Pentagon. They were reviewing historical Medal of Honor recommendations that may have been improperly evaluated due to racial considerations. Leo accepted these developments with characteristic humility, agreeing to a few carefully selected appearances but declining most. He didn't want to become a celebrity or a symbol. He simply wanted his story, and the stories of those who served alongside him, to be remembered truthfully. A week after the interview, Kelsey and Dev organized a surprise tribute for Leo at a local park where he had worked as a groundskeeper before retirement. Unlike the media circus that had surrounded him since the flight, this gathering was intimate and heartfelt. Local veterans, former colleagues, neighbors, and friends coming together to honor a man who had served them without fanfare for decades, under a massive oak tree that Leo himself had planted 30 years earlier. A simple bench was dedicated with a plaque reading, "In honor of Leonard E. McAllister, soldier, healer, neighbor. His quiet strength changed lives." As Leo ran his fingers, Over the engraved words, a young boy approached him shyly. "My grandpa says you're a hero," the child said, wide-eyed. Leo knelt to the boy's level despite the protest of aging knees. "Want to know a secret about heroes?" he asked gently. The boy nodded eagerly. "The real heroes are the ones who get up every morning and do what's right, even when nobody's watching. Like your grandpa, I bet. Like teachers and nurses and folks who help their neighbors." The boy considered this seriously. "But you saved people in the war." "I did," Leo acknowledged. "And I'm proud of that. But I'm just as proud of the people I've helped since then. Heroes aren't just made in war, son. They're made in how we treat each other every single day." As evening fell and the gathering dispersed, Captain William Harris approached Leo. The two men had spoken several times since the flight, each conversation deepening their unexpected bond. "My brother wants to see you," Harris said. "He's in a veteran's home in Virginia now. Not doing well, but he remembers you. Talks about you all the time since he heard the news." Leo nodded. "I'd like that. It's been too long." Harris hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling him. "Why weren't you at his ceremony when he received his commendation?" "He asked for you, but they told him you couldn't be located." A sad smile crossed Leo's face. "I was there, William, in the back. I saw him get his medal, heard his speech. But they made it clear my presence wasn't welcome at the reception afterward. Different times." Harris absorbed this with visible pain. "I never questioned why the black soldier in his stories wasn't at the ceremony. Never even occurred to me to ask." "Don't carry that," Leo said firmly. "We all have our blind spots. The question is what we do once they're pointed out to us." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, the younger veterans began drifting toward them, drawn by an unspoken recognition of shared experience across generations. Soon Leo found himself surrounded by a circle of men and women who had served in conflicts he'd only read about. Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq. They didn't ask for war stories or press him about medals. Instead, they asked how he had found peace, how he had carried the weight of memory without being crushed by it, how he had built a life of purpose after witnessing so much destruction. And Leo McAllister, who had spent decades avoiding such conversations, found himself becoming the mentor he had never had, sharing hard-won wisdom with those who would carry the torch forward. The hidden scars remained. They always would. But in sharing them, in bringing them into the light, they somehow became not just symbols of pain, but badges of survival, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal enough to allow for a life of meaning, service, and occasionally, when you least expected it, justice. 6 months had passed since the flight that changed Leo McAllister's life. Spring had given way to summer, and now autumn painted the trees outside his Atlanta home in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Leo sat on his front porch, sipping tea from a chipped mug that had been Martha's favorite. Dawn light filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows across the worn wooden boards. Today was important. Perhaps the most important day since that fateful flight. He'd pressed his old uniform one last time, making sure every crease was perfect, every button polished to a shine. Across the street, 8-year-old Marcus Thompson watched from his front yard. When Leo caught his eye, the boy straightened his small frame and offered a solemn salute. Leo returned the gesture, a lump forming in his throat. Since Ethan's interview had aired nationally, neighborhood children had taken to saluting him. They left hand-drawn cards in his mailbox and sometimes stopped by with cookies or questions about history. Leo, who had never had grandchildren of his own, found unexpected joy in these interactions. "Mr. McAllister," Marcus called out. "Are you really going to meet the president today?" Leo nodded. "That's the plan, son." "Will you tell him I said hello?" Leo smiled. "I surely will." Inside the house, Leo's phone rang. His daughter Olivia was calling from California, where she worked, as a professor of African American history. "Dad, just wanted to make sure you're ready for today. The car should be there in an hour." "I'm ready," Leo assured her. "Been ready my whole life, I suppose." After the call ended, Leo returned to the porch and his cooling tea. The last 6 months, had been a whirlwind he never could have anticipated. Ethan's interview had aired as a one-hour special on a major network, drawing 30 million viewers. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens had all commented on Leo's story of quiet heroism and unrecognized sacrifice. The Pentagon had indeed reviewed Leo's case, along with those of other minority servicemen whose achievements might have been diminished by prejudice. After a thorough investigation, they'd confirmed what Leo had known for 56 years. His actions in Vietnam had met every criterion for the Medal of Honor. Now, the President of the United States was prepared to correct a historical wrong in a ceremony at the White House. A black SUV pulled up to the curb precisely on schedule. Leo carefully locked his front door and walked down the steps, his dress uniform fitting less comfortably than it once had, but still conveying the dignity of his service. The driver, a young black woman in an Air Force uniform, opened the rear door with a respectful nod. "Sergeant McAllister, it's an honor to drive you today, sir." Inside the vehicle, Leo found Captain William Harris waiting. "Couldn't let you make this journey alone," Harris said with a smile. "Hope you don't mind." "The company," Leo clasped the younger man's hand. "Wouldn't have it any other way." As they drove to the airport, Harris updated Leo on his brother's condition. "Tom's having a good day today. He'll be watching the ceremony from the veterans' home. The staff is setting up a special viewing for all the residents." Leo nodded. He'd visited General Thomas Harris twice in recent months. The older man's health was failing, but his memory of that day in Vietnam remained crystal clear. "Your brother is a good man," Leo said simply. At the airport, they were ushered through a VIP entrance, bypassing the usual security lines. As they boarded the flight to Washington, D.C., every crew member stood at attention. The captain, a woman in her 40s, saluted Leo as he stepped aboard. "First class, Sergeant McAllister," she said with a warm smile. "Where you've belonged, all along." The other passengers, recognizing Leo from the news coverage, broke into spontaneous applause as he moved down the aisle. Leo acknowledged them with a nod, still uncomfortable with the attention, but learning to accept it with grace. Once seated, Leo gazed out the window at the Atlanta skyline receding below them. So much had changed since that Veterans Day flight. Ethan's story had sparked a national conversation about how America treats its veterans, particularly those from minority communities. The airline had implemented new training protocols, with Kelsey leading workshops on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. And Janice? After her termination, she'd disappeared from public view, declining all interview requests. Then, 3 months later, she'd resurfaced in an unexpected place, volunteering at a homeless shelter that served primarily black veterans. No cameras, no social media posts, just quiet service. When a reporter finally tracked her down, she'd said only, "I'm learning. That's all I want to say." In Washington, a small motorcade awaited them at Reagan National. The autumn day was perfect, crisp and clear, with a brilliant blue sky. As they drove past the monuments and memorials, Leo thought of the friends whose names were etched in black granite on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, men who would never grow old, never know that their sacrifice had meant something. At the White House, they were escorted through security and into a reception area where other guests had gathered. Olivia rushed forward to embrace her father, tears shining in her eyes. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Ethan was there too, along with Dev and Kelsey. They had formed an unlikely friendship in the months since the flight, united by their shared experience and determination to create meaningful change. They waited for the ceremony to begin. An elegant black woman in her 70s approached Leo. "Sergeant McAllister, I'm Michelle Barnes. My father was Robert Jenkins." Leo's eyes widened in recognition. "Little Bobby Jenkins? From Charlie Company?" She nodded, emotion visible on her face. "He didn't make it home, but he wrote about you in his last letter. Said you saved his buddy's life and promised to check on his family if—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I tried," Leo said softly. "After I got back, I went to see his mother in Memphis, brought her his personal effects that the Army had missed. She was a strong woman, reminded me of your father." Michelle embraced him. "Thank
You.
All these years, I wondered about my father's final days. Knowing he had someone like you watching over him brings me peace. Similar encounters followed. Family members of men Leo had served with, veterans who recognized his story as parallel to their own young soldiers who saw in him a standard to aspire to. Each conversation affirmed that Leo's life of quiet service had rippled outward in ways he'd never fully understood. Finally, they were ushered into the East Room, where chairs had been arranged for the ceremony. The president entered to "Hail to the Chief," and the formal proceedings began. Distinguished guests were acknowledged, the history of the Medal of Honor was recounted, and then Leo's citation was read aloud. A detailed account of his actions. On that July day in 1969, Leo stood at attention, his back straight despite his years, as the president draped the medal around his neck. The weight of it felt strange after so many decades of waiting. "Sergeant McAllister," the president said, his voice carrying throughout the room and to the millions watching on television, "on behalf of a grateful nation, I present you with the Medal of Honor for actions above and beyond the call of duty. Your courage under fire and unwavering commitment to your fellow soldiers represent the highest ideals of our nation." After the applause subsided, Leo was invited to speak. He hadn't prepared formal remarks, trusting instead the wisdom that had guided him through a lifetime of challenges. "I never served to be thanked," he began, his deep voice steady and clear. "I served so others could come home. Some wounds never heal, but they remind us we survived." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This medal isn't just for me. It's for the men who didn't come home. It's for the families who waited. It's for all those who served honorably, but were denied full recognition because of prejudice." Leo looked out at the assembled guests, his gaze finding Olivia, then Harris, then Ethan. "America is at its best when it acknowledges its mistakes and tries to correct them. It's taken 56 years for this particular correction, but I'm grateful to witness it. My wife Martha always believed this day would come. She never lost faith in America's capacity to grow, to learn, to become more just. Neither have I." The ceremony concluded with a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. As the formal proceedings gave way to a reception, Leo found himself at the center of attention once again. But now, 6 months into his unexpected fame, he handled it with more ease, understanding that his story had become important to people for reasons that transcended his personal comfort. In the weeks that followed, Leo's experience catalyzed changes that extended far beyond his own recognition. Congress opened hearings into historical racial discrimination in veteran affairs. The Department of Defense established a permanent review board to examine potentially overlooked valor. Veterans groups launched new initiatives to support minority service members transitioning to civilian life. Kelsey's work with the airline expanded into an industry-wide movement to address implicit bias in customer service. She appeared on talk shows and at corporate events, always crediting Leo's dignity as the inspiration for her advocacy. "He taught me that speaking up isn't just about pointing out what's wrong," she told a conference of airline executives. "It's about standing firm in what's right, even when your job is at risk." Dev Taylor channeled his tech industry success into creating the Leo McAllister Fund, a scholarship program for young Black veterans pursuing education after military service. The first recipient was Marcus Thompson's older brother, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, and Ethan. His reporting on Leo's story earned him a Pulitzer nomination, but more significantly, it shifted his career focus from documenting distant conflicts to examining the battles still being fought at home, for recognition, for equality, for the simple dignity of being seen. 1 year after the White House ceremony, Ethan published a memoir titled Seat 14C, What I Saw When the World Looked Away. The dedication read, "For Leo McAllister, and for all the silent heroes sitting in the wrong seat." 5 years passed. The seasons turned, governments changed, new headlines pushed old ones aside. But in a high school classroom in South Atlanta, Leo McAllister's story lived on. For this year's Black History Month project, Ms. Wilson announced to her 11th grade history class, "We'll be focusing on unsung heroes from our own community." A hand shot up. "Ms. Wilson, can our group do Sergeant McAllister?" "My grandmother," Has his book. Ms. Wilson smiled. That's a wonderful choice, Zoe. He's actually scheduled to speak to our school next week. The excitement this announcement generated reflected how deeply Leo's story had embedded itself in the community's consciousness. What had begun as a viral moment of injustice recognized had evolved into a lasting legacy of education and inspiration. At 78, Leo had found an unexpected third act in life. He'd published a memoir with Ethan's help, established a community center for veterans in South Atlanta, and become a sought-after speaker who connected historical struggles for civil rights with contemporary challenges. Most precious to Leo, however, were the quiet moments, like his weekly visits to Martha's grave in Oakland Cemetery. On this particular morning, the cemetery was peaceful, birds singing in the ancient oaks that stood sentinel over generations of Atlanta's departed souls. Leo knelt with difficulty beside the simple headstone and placed a single white rose against the marble. From his pocket he withdrew an envelope, a letter he'd written the night before. "Hello, my love," he said softly, running his weathered hand over Martha's name. "Thought I'd read this to you today." He opened the envelope and unfolded the pages. Within: Dear Martha, another year has passed without you beside me, but I feel your presence every day. The children send their love. Olivia's book on Black women educators during integration has been nominated for a national award. She dedicated it to you, of course. You were right all along about speaking the truth, even when it seemed no one was listening. Your voice echoes in everything I do now. When those young people look at me like I have all the answers, I just share what you taught me. That love outlasts hatred, that quiet dignity speaks louder than anger, that serving others is the highest calling any of us can answer. I still miss your laugh. I miss your hands on mine. I miss the way you'd call me soldier boy even when we were both old and gray. But I'm keeping my promise to live well and fully until we meet again. Leo continued reading, his voice sometimes breaking but always regaining its strength. When he finished, he carefully refolded the letter and placed it beneath the rose. Won't be too much longer, Martha, he whispered. But there's still work to do here. Across town, in a small public park near Leo's home, workers were installing a new bench overlooking the pond where neighborhood children fed ducks, and elderly residents enjoyed the peaceful surroundings. A brass plaque gleamed in the sunlight. To Sergeant Leonard E. McAllister, may future travelers never sit in the wrong seat again. The bench had been Kelsey's idea. Now the head of the airline's equity division, she had implemented sweeping changes to company policy and culture. Every new employee heard Leo's story during orientation. Customer service training included specific modules on recognizing and countering bias. The company that had once suspended her for speaking up now celebrated her as a champion of its renewed values. At a homeless shelter across town, a woman worked silently in the kitchen, preparing meals for the day's guests. Janice Whitmore had found purpose in service, though she avoided recognition or praise. The lessons of that fateful flight had transformed her in ways even she couldn't fully articulate. The anger that had fueled her prejudice had been slowly replaced by a humble desire to make amends, not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of care for those she had once dismissed. When a new volunteer asked why she chose this particular shelter, Janice simply said, "I'm repaying a debt." Years passed. Leo continued his work, though his steps grew slower and his public appearances less frequent. He found joy in simple pleasures, teaching his great-grandchildren to fish, mentoring young veterans, tending the garden that Martha had once loved. A crisp autumn morning in his 91st year, Leo didn't come down for breakfast. His daughter Olivia, visiting for the weekend, found him peaceful in his bed, a photograph of Martha clutched in his hand. The old soldier had finally stood down from his long watch. News of Leo's passing spread quickly. Flags across the nation were lowered to half-staff. The president issued a statement honoring a man whose quiet courage transformed not only the lives he saved in combat, but the nation he continued to serve with unwavering dignity. Leo's funeral became a gathering of unlikely connections. Veterans from multiple generations, airline employees, politicians, journalists, and hundreds of ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by his story. The small church couldn't contain the crowd, so speakers were set up outside for those who stood in respectful silence beneath the Georgia pines. Marcus Thompson, now a grown man and an Army officer himself, delivered the eulogy. "Sergeant McAllister once told me that heroes aren't just made in war," he said, his voice steady despite his emotion. "They're made in how we treat each other every single day." He lived that truth. He showed us what it means to carry wounds with grace, to face injustice with dignity, to serve without expectation of reward. Captain William Harris, now retired, placed his pilot's wings on Leo's casket. "You carried me longer than I ever carried you," he whispered. In the years that followed, Leo's legacy continued to grow. A scholarship in his name supported minority students pursuing careers in medicine. A documentary about his life won an Emmy. His memoir became required reading in military leadership courses, but perhaps the most fitting tribute came 5 years after his death, when Ethan Cole found himself on Flight 2187 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., the same route Leo had traveled that fateful day. As Ethan settled into his seat, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the McAllister route. Today, as on every Veterans Day, we honor the legacy of Sergeant Leonard McAllister by reserving Seat 2A. Ethan looked toward the front of the plane. In the first row, a neatly folded American flag rested on Seat 2A, Leo's name embroidered in gold thread across its stripes. As the plane lifted into the clouds above Atlanta, Ethan thought about the unlikely chain of events that had brought them all together years ago: a prejudiced airline supervisor, a veteran with a story to tell, a captain who recognized an old debt, and ordinary people who chose to stand up rather than look away. Leo had never sought fame or recognition. He had simply lived by a code that put service above self, dignity above comfort, and grace above grievance. In doing so, he had left behind a legacy more powerful than any medal, a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single act of courage, witnessed at 30,000 feet on an otherwise ordinary day. The plane banked gently to the north, carrying Leo's story forward into the endless sky. What would you have done if you witnessed Leo's story unfold? Would you have remained silent, or found the courage to speak up? Like and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge us to confront the everyday injustices hiding in plain sight.